Welcome to the Dragonfly Rising podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you for joining me today as we continue to work together to make a difference. Let's explore how we can use our voice today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tami Dean. I am so excited to continue our conversation from our last episode with Kate Pohl. If you remember, Kate is a history teacher from Normal, Illinois. I am super excited for us to dig into some ways that she and her colleagues are teaching history and how they are connecting that and thinking through, right? Like what happens in history, what, forms collective memory, nostalgia, super compelling things. Kate and her colleagues have been working and presenting on this. So let's dive right back into the conversation and hear some more from Kate. This work you're doing and presenting and talking about teaching race through our memory, right? Because our perception and awareness influences our understanding of history and interpretation. And I find that super intriguing, right? So memory affects our memory of history. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about that and this work you were doing and the power of imagery, and what do we remember? I just found it so compelling. I would love if you would share a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I think I first have to give a major shout out to two of my colleagues, David Harnish and Megan Summers, because this was their project first.
Okay.
And Megan has moved out of U.S. studies, and David and I now do a lot of teaching and collaborating together, and we've built from their foundations. I have to give credit where credit is due.
Love that.
Yeah. So sure. So what we do is, instead of spending, hey, everyone, let's go through every battle of the Civil War that ever happened and every general, every president, which I realize can be fun. I'm not saying throw that out altogether. I want to hook students in the stories of history.
Yes.
But I think the much more important story is, how has that been remembered in our collective memory? We, all, myself and my colleagues, believe this. And so it started with David reading this book by historian David Blight called Race and Reunion. And I'm going to forget the subtitle. Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory. Okay. And so what Blight proposes, and the reason this is important is because we have our students then examine the Civil War through Blight's three lenses. So he says, as soon as the Civil War comes to an end, it's really that Reconstruction era that's more important. Because even though the 13th Amendment has been ratified, well, 13th, 14th, 15th, there have been all these great civil rights additions. Slavery is abolished. For a couple of years, Black Americans do get some opportunities and respect and are elected to political office. But simultaneously, instantly, people are going to push back against it. White Americans are going to push back against it. Just because the law has changed, that doesn't mean racism has disappeared. And so they start making very conscious efforts to change how we remember what this war was about, which leads us to the lost cause mythology. So slavery wasn't really about, even though it's absolutely about white supremacy, let's put up lots and lots of monuments all over the South, and this will get us into
states' rights.
Right. States' rights to slaves. Like, people forget the prepositional phrase that belongs at the end of that. States' rights to slavery. So for instance, I should back up. One of the first things we do is have the students learn, what was the Civil War about? What caused it? Because, and we use this tool called Pear Deck, where you can get anonymous responses from students. Yeah. And sometimes when you're having a challenging conversation, that's a good way to start, because they can, I know who they are behind the scenes. So there is some moderation, but they can be a little more honest with each other. And it never fails. We have quite a few students who say, well, it's states' rights, it's Southern heritage, it's Southern culture, which is in their minds different and removed from slavery. And so we have to back them up and say, wait a minute, if I look at the primary sources, that's not true. And I'm going to quote
Mm.
from, so we use a part of Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with
Yeah.
History. Yeah. With the history of slavery
Powerful
across
book, y'all.
America.
I highly recommend you read that.
Yeah,
How
incredible. And for all you social studies teachers, well, actually anyone, he also is the host of, if you know the Crash Course videos, there's a newer series called Black American History, US History, and he hosts that as well. So he is visiting Monticello. Each chapter in his book is going to different historical sites to see how is the Civil War remembered. And the differences are stark. But while he's at Monticello, one of the tour guides said, and I'm quoting him here, he says, I think that history is the story of the past using all the available facts. Nostalgia is a fantasy about the past using no facts. And somewhere in between is memory, which is kind of this blend of history and a little bit of emotion. I mean, history is kind of about what you need to know. Nostalgia is what you want to hear. And
mm.
so that's what we're trying to make the students examine is, are we looking at history, memory, nostalgia, and where do you and your own personal identity, where do you fit into this?
Mm.
And that can be really challenging for students. So again, if I go back to the Pear Deck thing and say, so to you, you had said something about images.
Yeah.
So I think I know what you're referring to.
Yes.
The set induction to this unit, we have the
Yeah.
students look at a series of images. The first one, I believe, is the South Carolina flag, the US flag. There's another one up there. And you can see this old South Carolina flag that has part of the Confederate flag in it. And it's flying over the Capitol building.
Yeah.
And we just say, give us, 5 words that pop into your head when you see this. And our students have some pretty interesting things to say.
I imagine they do.
Yes, they do. So
This.
for that picture, student responses ranged from wrong, racism, Confederacy to freedom, bravery, valor, nationalism to racism, normalized, divided, and liberty, tradition, and pride. So that's really important for me as a teacher to know that that is their
Wow.
starting point, right? And they're
Like
essentially looking at a Confederate flag.
like that.
Yep.
I just that is the whole like that's
Yep.
trajectory, right? And I just think it's important to remind the audience right now, like she's in the Midwest.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
I think sometimes people think some of those responses would only come from the South.
Well, yeah, and it went a step further. And then I put up a picture of the Confederate flag. We were playing off of something that actually happened at our school, a hate incident involving the Confederate flag. And so some time had passed, but this is also part of my job is I'm not going to ignore that this happened. Our students know it happened. We have to find a way to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I had put up the flag and said, I made this statement and my Pear Deck just said, respond. That's it. Respond.
Hmm.
And so the statement said, people, including students here, should be able to fly the Confederate flag because it is not necessarily synonymous with slavery. And I'll just give you a couple of responses. One student said, absolutely not. If you fly that flag, you and your flag are racist. Another one said, how can you say with such certainty that slavery was the sole cause of the Civil War? None of us in this classroom were there. We can't understand what went through the soldiers' minds. I can't believe there was only one cause for all this destruction. Couldn't there have been something else that made men kill literally their own brothers? And then I had one more. Oh, here we go. And I'll read you one last one. If your great 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 grandfather had slaves, it was obviously a human rights violation, but the stars and bars actually represents the South. They need to represent their own country somehow, right? My family's from the South, and I know Black people who fly this flag proudly. It's about Southern heritage. So I have all of those students in my room.
Mhm.
Think, right? How do I teach all of them?
Yeah.
And I know that once I put these primary sources in their hands, and the first primary sources we show them, not the first, sorry, we build up to this, are the actual articles of secession from all of the southern states. And and we steal it actually from Clint Smith, quotes them. So we're using part of his book here. Every one of them is clear as day that they are seceding because of slavery. And in fact, the worst of them will say, we recognize that we are seceding and we recognize our right to do so because we are the dominant race. I mean, there's just no question that and then there's Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gives his famous cornerstone speech that slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederate.
Right.
That's the history piece, right?
Yep.
But what I'm seeing in their responses is not history. I'm seeing collective memory. I'm seeing identity.
Yeah.
And so how do I get those students to, number one, recognize the tension between facts, what we know, and what they feel? And that's really hard to do because I need them to stay in the conversation with me, right? If
Yeah.
I just throw all the primary sources at them from the start and wag my finger at them and say, "You're wrong, you're horrible. Go, how can you live with
Why
yourself?"
do you think that? You shouldn't be thinking that. You are
Right,
smarter.
right. That's I'm now insulting the one student who said, "This is Southern culture, and I know Black people who fly the
Mm.
flag." What happens if I immediately tell that student, "Well, you're an idiot and you're a racist," and he's out. I've lost him. And
Right.
and how can we all grow and change if I let that happen?
Yeah.
So this project, which takes weeks, by the way, I don't want to say this happens overnight. Number one, we put in breaks everywhere. So we'll teach them a little bit of history, and then there's a break where it's a restorative justice listening circle or a pear deck or a journal where they can
Mhm.
talk about, how are we doing? Do you want to take a breath here? I'm stealing from Jason Reynolds in Stamped in the
Yes.
remix, right? When
Yes.
he sends something really challenging, he puts in bold print, stop, breathe, everybody take a breath, calm down. So we try to put those pauses in as we go through these very difficult ideas.
Mhm.
Um, and then they examine, okay, let's look at the United Daughters of the Confederacy and how they made every effort to make sure that these monuments went up all over the South. And they were all going to be about the glory of Confederate generals.
Mhm.
And so we have the students look at a timeline. Those I know, like, people like to argue, but that's history. And if you take them down, you're taking down history. Okay, whose history? Is it history or is it national memory and national Confederate memory? Because if
Mhm.
it's history, why then? And I'll have them examine a map of where lynching took place. There's some really great visual resources that go with this.
Mhm.
And it's everywhere, it's all over the South. Okay, well, then why are all of these schools and highways and theaters and libraries and named after Confederate generals, but I only have one, Brian Stevenson's The Peace and Justice Memorial, which is pretty darn new, to
Mhm.
recognize that lynching happened all over the South. I can't find it. It's not visible that that happened. That's a problem. That
Uh-huh.
that's not history. That's something different is happening there.
Mm.
Then they'll look at textbooks. Okay, how do textbooks tell this story differently in different times and places? And I also like to use Homi Bhabha, who is a Harvard professor, and he talked about the right to narrate.
Mhm.
Who gets to tell the story? Whose story is being told?
Mhm.
And that's what we're constantly throwing at them, right? So then maybe we'll fast forward and look at the birth of clips from Birth of a Nation,
Right.
various things like that. And so you're watching this lost cause be written into history, and the actual history is just being silenced, which means the voices of Black Americans are also being silenced.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
then to go back to Blight, his next vision is reconciliation, which is okay. we need the North and the South to come together. So I'll tell you what, we'll just talk about how brave soldiers are on both sides. Aren't they brave? Look at their fighting. Look at what they did.
Mhm.
Okay, do you want to talk about slaves? No, no, no. Let's not talk about slavery. Let's just talk about great battles and soldiers, right? So they'll look at movies, presidential speeches, just lots of different resources on how that has been told. And
Yeah.
then the third vision, which of course is what we're trying to get them to, is the emancipationist vision. Well, wait a second. How do I once again, or how not once again, how do I for the first time give that right to narrate back to the people who were impacted the most? And I would argue continue to be impacted by slavery and everything that came after it.
Mhm.
And you can't reconciliation, not the vision of teaching history, but us as a country cannot happen until we're willing to grapple with the truth of, yeah, and with history, not just with collective memory, not with nostalgia, but with actual history. And that's slow going. That's hard to do, but I think that's a battle I'm happy to fight for the rest of my career if I have to. So
Yeah.
that's what they do. They pick something. They pick an angle. I'm going to look at movies. I'm going to look at books. I'm going to look at education. I'm going to look at one lens, and I'm going to watch that narrative of the Civil War and collective memory change over time
Mm.
and compare it to actual history. So that's essentially what the project does.
Wow.
Yeah, they come up with them. The students, I mean, these are sophomores doing this. So I know it sounds intense, but if we move slowly enough, they're in. They'll stick with us. And as we said at the beginning, teenagers are capable of amazing things. They just
Yeah.
need you. They need that literacy specialist to say, yeah, they can handle that source. Let's just put in those literacy supports to help them. And they can do it. They are
Yeah.
really capable of doing all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also highlights the importance of the intentionality behind the planning on the part of the educator, um, as well. It's kind of twofold, but I just think the opportunity is the most key part right here. Like, how are we building the opportunity? And, also requires a pushback a little bit because textbooks,
Yeah.
right, are influenced, historically by certain areas of the United States.
What? What are you talking about?
Uh-huh, 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 because of their population. And so it then just expands into the rest of the nation, right? Like we're trying to
Yes.
appease, I'm just gonna say we're trying to appease Texas. So we write our textbook in a certain way, and it erases the erasure that happens, right? So the other piece here is the primary source documents.
Mm.
And every wonderful, amazing history teacher I know, or preparer of history teachers, wants and talks about the importance of primary source documents in understanding and evaluating history. So this is my plug,
Yeah.
right? So I get it, teachers, you might have a textbook you have to do, and you could bring in a supplemental source of a primary source document. Just
Hey,
this is just me. This is like that opportunity. So I'm just sharing this with you. I would love you to see you do that. Like, just try it out, bring in a primary
yeah.
source document. Um, because it changes the conversation.
Yeah. And it's hard for what it's worth, by the way, at working for, I think if I recall, I was talking to one of our colleagues at ISU about this. I think they actually are the fourth largest history ed program in the country.
Mhm.
Um, and the first largest in Illinois. Lots and lots of history pre-service teachers. And man, do they push historical thinking, primary sources, and making sure that everyone's right to narrate is there, that everyone's voice is heard. In fact, and I love this, I think I've changed the way I've taught over the years, is you want to get sources, you want sources that speak to each other. And sometimes they don't agree with each other. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting because putting those articles of secession in students' hands, you can just watch some of them tense up, right? You can't, and I have to do it kind of carefully because, like I said, I want them to stay with me. I want them to
Mhm.
stay in the conversation, and I want them to understand this is not a personal attack on them and their identity.
Yeah.
But what if there's an opportunity here to change that narrative as they
Mhm.
pass it on in their own families, right? Um,
Yeah.
and I think of we also use a lot of Goldie Muhammad's the cultivating genius. Like,
Fabulous.
yeah, well,
Fabulous.
I need students to see their identity, but what's so scary is sometimes your identity falls on the wrong side of history. And how do you grapple with that?
Yes.
So that is part of the lesson too, if we can pull it off. And like I said, when you put those primary sources in their hands, you can just watch some students tense up. They don't quite know that cognitive dissonance, which is what
Uh-huh.
I want. I need cognitive dissonance in order for learning to happen. But that's why we also say, let's just take a breath.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's that journal opportunity, or here's that listening circle or pair deck or whatever we need to do. We're going to take a little pause because that's a
Mm.
lot to take in right now.
Yeah.
Um, and some of them go home and talk to their families about it, which I love. I think that's great, but it's tense. It's a tense process. So we also make it a very slow process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Uh,
that's an important part, right?
Yeah.
Um, Again, the marathon, not a sprint. So,
Right. Right. And I'm just
um,
a sophomore high school teacher, right? Like I just want them to, I guess my goal is by the time they leave my class, they're still thinking that things that they thought were black and white are now
mhm.
gray. And if
Yeah.
that's where they're at the end of the year, I'm going to consider it a job well done. That they're not as certain of things as they used to be.
Mhm.
I think that's my job.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And I think like the world can use more of that, right? Like the
Right?
questioning,
Right.
the
Yes.
inquiry, the conversation, the learning to engage in a
Yeah.
difficult conversation, right? I think that
Yeah.
like that's what I hear these students are getting the opportunity to do is to learn how to have a conversation with someone that has a different viewpoint or different perspective or uh, different life experience or all of the above in this same space. And so, how can I, listen and respond versus listen to react? Right. And,
Yes.
you know, this work has a lot of emotion attached to it. Equity work and social justice has so much emotion
Yes.
and learning how to navigate those motions, whether you're learning, whether you're leading, right, are
Well,
is such a important piece, and I love that you're making this space for reflection and to feel, what I'm
right.
feeling, um, and and
Yeah.
and have an outlet for it that isn't the person that I might be disagreeing with right now, right?
Right. Yeah. But it's tricky because I should also say, I hope this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm also not there to coddle white students, right? Like I understand they're teenagers. They're still growing up. I want them involved in the conversation. But on the flip side of that, I have to be careful about I need them to understand. So if I go with the slavery example, I need students to understand the violence and horror of
Mhm.
slavery. But I don't want to re-traumatize my students of color either. Right. And I it's a tricky balance to say, oh, hey, can everyone be patient while white students and white families come along with us?
Mhm.
And that's not terribly fair to ask of students of color, right?
Yes.
So that's something I'm constantly working on. And I don't know. Don't ask me what the solution to that is because I'm not sure I've got it figured out. Um,
Yeah.
and again, I'm a white teacher. So that's also tricky. Um, I want my black students, like, obviously, I want them to be able to come talk to me if they have concerns or they've had enough or they need a break. But I also wish desperately that my faculty, this is something we're working on, is I wish our faculty was diverse. It's not.
Yeah.
because those students need also to have someone with their own lived experience to talk to about this.
Mhm.
So it's all very, very tricky. And we still have I like our project. I love it, but we have a lot of work to do. We're not done here. Yeah, we're not done.
Mhm. And, I really do. I appreciate that
Yeah.
about where you are in the work, right? Because I think as we're having this conversation serves as a model to those that are in the work or those that are getting ready to start it. Like, you can have been doing this work for a while, and I keep sharing this with people, like, right? Like, I've been involved in this social justice equity space in education for 25 years, and I always feel old when I say that, but I'm gonna keep saying it because I'm really not old. But uh
No, you're not.
no, not at all.
No, we're not.
No, we are not. But even in this 25 years, just like you, I'm still learning, and there are still
Yeah.
people that I learn from and read from or listen to or, talk to in this community. So I think and even though you haven't really used that description of it, a professional community to engage in this work for support, reflection, ideas, growing, and I feel like that's what I want you all to take away from this is that community that how are we setting up communities of support for students? How are we advocating for those? And then also how are we building our own community um, in our own learning and understanding and seeking out those voices or people with different experiences or taking opportunities to learn or read um, from different resources.
Yeah. This was an old one. Read this book by Peter Block that was just called Community, the Structure of Belonging. And I remember him talking about leadership not as something that individuals do, but that communities do. And I love that because, yeah, I mean, that the thing that has made me the teacher that I am, my best work is when I am collaborating with my people, with my community. And that community can include other faculty, it can include my students,
Hmm.
it can include the parents and guardians, it can include Illinois State. Your community is bigger than you think it is sometimes. And
Hmm.
you need to reach out to all those resources and recognize when you've got an expert in your midst. And
Hmm.
I can't believe I'm going to say this after what we were saying with women, but there is a time and a place to be humble. There is a time and a place to go, somebody else can do this better than I can, and
Hmm.
I need to ask for their advice.
Hmm.
Uh, that's important too. So yeah, I'm community. It's all about community.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We have shared so many tidbits and opportunities and resources, and I will drop all the resources, y'all, in the information about this episode and on my website so you can go and grab them because I know you want to go read them all because they are amazing. I love for us to end on thinking about what's that one next step that educators could take to use their voice, right, in this equity and social justice work? Like, what would be your advice?
Oh, that's a tough question. Okay, well, the next step for them, I guess I would say it's to your point. It's get to know your community. I know that sounds a little strange. We all want to take action right here, right now.
Mhm,
But if you don't know your students, their environment, the culture of the community you live in, the resources that are available to you first, making change happen is much more difficult. But if the people around you feel like, oh, you really care what I think and what my lived experience is and what I have to say and what my expertise is, they will open up. They will say, "Oh, no one's ever asked me that before. Sure, yeah, can I?" And automatically, just in asking, getting to know the resources that are all around you, that
mhm,
have and reach out to people that are different than you are, whether
mhm,
that be in their discipline or in their level of experience. Like I learned, it's amazing what I learned from pre-service teachers, right?
yeah,
They're going to class every day. They are on top of the latest scholarship in a way that I will never be.
mhm.
So I can't tell you how many book recommendations I've gotten from college students
My
because it's
TBR
just,
list is absurd, but
oh, right. My my Goodreads list. Last time I checked Goodreads, I think I have my want to read list is like 1,800 books. It's just insane. But I'm going to keep them there someday. As soon as this interview ends, I'm just going to start reading until I die. That's the only way I'm going to get through all those
That's the only way it makes
books.
sense. So if anybody wants to pay Kate to read, she's here.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it. But yeah, I think that's step one is making everyone else aware that you care about what they have to say and that you want to incorporate it in your classroom and that you want them to be able to connect to what you're doing and that you want them to see this is authentic, important, and significant. And it's, it's once everyone has that comfort level, oh my gosh, you can change the world. I know that sounds idealistic, but hey, you can't be a teacher unless you still have a little bit of idealism.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
So
yes.
I just think you got to get to know everybody as best you possibly can and tap into those resources.
Absolutely.
Recognize what you have. That would be step one.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Love it. That's amazing advice for our educator friends listening today. So I want to thank Kate for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, it's been great. I thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I feel honored and privileged and also just very excited to get to hang out with you for an hour. That's pretty wonderful because it's been too long.
I know it has been too long. So I want to thank you all. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and shoot me any questions if you have any from today's episode. You can reach out if you're on Spotify. You can answer on that Q&A or head on over to Instagram at Dragonfly Rising LLC and drop me a question there. So thank you all so much for joining us today. This wraps up another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember that action is always greater than inaction. How will you use your voice today?